Welcome to the Orca. Over the past 3 decades, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has grown into a major force in national public policy. Now, one man who's been part of that for nearly the entire time, from the early days with a young, fiery upstart named Jason Kenney leading the way, to its presence today in every province. Troy Lanigan has helped the CTF and the taxpayers it represents to several significant policy victories. Now, this fall, Troy is leaving as president and CEO of the CTF, having spent 27 years with the organization, and he joins us now to talk about the successes and about the future of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Troy, good morning and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know, take us back. How did the CTF, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, how did it come into being?
Well, it was around the time of the GST, and it wasn't that the GST was a better or tax than what it was replacing. The problem is that people at the time saw it as another taxing lever at a time where governments weren't getting their spending under control. Between like 1983 and 93, revenues had doubled, yet there was still huge deficits. Government was still growing. So a bunch of guys in Western Canada got together and organized a series of Axe the Tax rallies that were largely across West, but made their way into Ontario as well. And in the aftermath of those rallies, you'd think they'd pack up the chairs and go home disappointed. But really what those folks that organized those rallies said is we need a permanent, professional taxpayer presence that can pre-act rather than react to what governments are doing. And out of that came the Association of Alberta Taxpayers, the Association of Saskatchewan Taxpayers, later to become incorporated in 1990, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, that over time is now growing to be represented in every part of the country.
When you look back over your past 27 years, is there one particular victory of which you're most proud?
Yeah, I'd say the 1990s. I think the organization helped, along with the Reform Party and think tanks and others, but we played a really key role, I think, in helping change the conversation about the size of government, about deficits in the mid-1990s. We just couldn't keep going on borrowed time and borrowed money. And governments started to balance their budgets. And it wasn't, a particular party. It was the NDP government of Roy Romano in Saskatchewan. It was Paul Martin that I would say, as I sit here and looking back on 27 years, put down the best federal budget, certainly of my lifetime, in 1995. They really went and looked at all of government spending and made meaningful cuts to get the size of government under control and balance that budget. And what happened? We balanced budgets federally and in the provinces, and then by 2000 we were in a position to cut taxes. And we had a relative period of prosperity. Canada led growth in the G7 for many, many years because we had made the preconditions. We got our spending under control in the mid-90s that allowed that growth to happen. So to me, the mid-90s were a really key time, again, because it wasn't a particular party. It was this consensus that was being built that we need to balance our budgets. And even the NDP governments, when they were running, said, we will balance the budget. And the debates were largely, what kind of tax cuts should we have, not whether we should have tax cuts. So I think that was probably the highlight. I remember Jason Kenney and I taking the national debt clock around, to every small shopping mall, whether it was in Kindersley, Saskatchewan, or wherever it was. Yeah, and setting it up. And, it was, retail selling of ideas. Like, let's talk about this deficit. Let's look at it real time. And what does it mean? And what are the implications if we don't get this balanced? And we did that in the 90s.
But costs increase, and they increase at a rate that's different than a person's income. So it appears now that taxes are on the rise. Where are we, and how do you view the future then?
Well, we certainly face some challenges now. We're getting back to these debates that I thought we had won. We still need to balance our budgets. We're still going to get eaten alive by interest costs. We have an aging population. We should be balancing budgets today with absolute urgency because the demographic shifts we're facing in 10, 20 years are going to bring even more pressure than we faced in the 1990s. So a lot of these debates, whether it's balancing budget or even trade, I thought we'd won these debates on the merits of trade. And again, it's not a particular political party. we're back to the days of, debating mercantilism almost. Like, it's ridiculous. So we've got to be vigilant. We've got to make these arguments more forcefully, and I think in new and different ways as the time goes by. We're having conversations in different places today, advocacy groups, think tanks are, than we were when I started out in the early 1990s.
You talk about trade, and while Canada is a good trader, it's still fairly small in the global perspective. And we live beside the largest economic engine on the planet. So how do you cope with that?
Well, our trade with the United States is important, but also opening up new markets. I think the work that
De-emphasize trade with the United States?
Sorry?
De-emphasize trade with the United States?
No, I mean, we need that market. It's our natural trading alliance, our north-south. I mean, that goes back to when the Federation was created. But yeah, I mean, global trade is also important. I mean, as part of what we're talking about with the pipeline, our discounts on oil going down to the United States because we're trapped by that market to some extent. So yes, trade with the U.S., but yes, trade worldwide. And over the last 20 years, we've actually seen more trade. And there's a direct correlation to, the degree of poverty that's happened around the world. When we trade, people are better off across the board. We know this. So trade needs to continually flourish to improve people's lives. And to grow enterprise and opportunities and everything else that flows from it.
What do you think about the direction this country is headed in right now?
Well, we have some challenging times. I mean,
what does that mean?
Well, bigger government, more intervention. I mean, these debates are, back on. I mean, they ebb and flow, but we're right back in the middle of it. And for our organization in particular, I mean, the carbon tax has probably been, the biggest lightning rod, certainly in our last 5 to 10 years. But, I think the tide is shifting on that issue. If you look back 5-6 years ago, it seemed like a consensus across the country. It was lock, stock, and barrel.
Look at Ontario, look at Saskatchewan, Alberta.
New Brunswick. We don't know what's going to happen there, but you had potentially the leader of the Conservative Party campaigned against it. Our friend Jason Kenney, we were just talking about, coming in Alberta, and he will be a strong and articulate voice, I think, at the national level as well. So, we are seeing some pushback on that. It hasn't been it hasn't been locked up to the extent I think proponents might have hoped it was 4 or 5 years ago.
But don't you have to change your mindset now? Because what was accomplished in the 90s, we seem, as you mentioned, we've lost our direction because we have governments now, provincial and federal, come in and say, it's okay, the deficit is only going to be X number of billions of dollars, but our plan is in the long range to balance the books. But right now they're willing to accept huge deficits.
Yeah, well, it's like being in the 25th year of the 5-year balanced budget plan, right? Like we always talk about getting it balanced at some point, but we never seem to get there. So, in the 90s, a lot of provincial governments brought in balanced budget laws, and those have been neutered since about 2008 on, unfortunately. But there were penalties for politicians if the budget wasn't balanced. Those laws existed in a lot of provinces. Referendums required in Ontario. Mike Harris brought in that law. Going back, Gary Filmon in Manitoba brought in a law. There had to be a province-wide referendum if you were going to increase taxes. That's the kind of, I think, assurance that's good for taxpayers, and it puts, I think, real discipline around politicians. And in fairness to politicians, they get hundreds of people appearing before their committees every time they sit to meet, wanting to spend more money, making demands on the wallets of others. Those kind of laws, I think, allow them the permission to say no as well, because they know that they have a fence around them in terms of what they can do often. And they need that. The taxpayers need that for long-term security, especially with the demographic challenges and things that we're facing in this country over the next 10, 20 years are very, very serious issues.
So it's safe to say it's not that you're against taxes as long as the government spend the money judiciously and wisely.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that governments just shouldn't do. I think that's fair to say. I mean, a lot of, corporate welfare programs, government in the business of business, they have no business in that. I mean, let the private sector run those things. And government can open up other sectors too. I mean, in this province, we're seeing a clampdown on private health clinics. Well, there's there's real people with real suffering waiting for procedures that impact their lives and the lives of their families. I mean, we need to allow where the private sector can come in and provide alternatives to alleviate that, and that needs to grow, that needs to flourish. And for government to centralize and monopolize is limiting people's choices, and at the end of the day, it's harm for them. So yeah, some things government just shouldn't be in, but in many other areas, government can play. I mean, private sector can play a much bigger role.
So what's next for Troy Lanigan?
I'm not sure. I'm hoping maybe to do some consulting work. I've got one project that I'll be involved with, a think tank project early in the new year. We'll be announcing and talking, and hopefully I'll be able to come back and talk a bit more about that as well.
You're always welcome.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your time, and best of luck.
Thank you very much for having me.